Shalom Mishpocha. It is heading into the wee hours of the morning. And I don't know, I seem to get inspired to do a video blog at this time. Maybe it's because the house is quiet and no one needs me and it's very peaceful. And so I start to think and try to reflect on things that would encourage others. And tonight, I was just wondering if you understood the difference between Talmud and Torah. I'm wondering this because many interpretations of Scripture are taught that Yeshua, Jesus, was speaking against the Torah of Moshe, when in all actuality he was not speaking against the Torah of Moshe. He was speaking against something that is said in Scripture that's called the tradition of the fathers. I think it occurs in the book of Mark, one of the instances where that phrase is said, and I'll read it to you just so you can understand where I'm coming from. Mark chapter 7. I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Bible, one of my favorite translations. The Pirushim, Pharisees, and some of the Torah teachers who had come from Yerushalayim gathered together with Yeshua and saw that some of his Talmidim, or disciples, ate with ritually unclean hands, that is, without doing a nitalat yadayim. For the Pirushim, and indeed all the Judeans, holding fast to the tradition of the elders, do not eat unless they have given their hands a ceremonial washing. Also, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they have rinsed their hands up to the wrist, and they adhere to many other traditions, such as washing cups, pots, and bronze vessels. The Pirushim and the Torah teachers asked him, "Why don't your Talmidim live in accordance with the tradition of the elders, but instead eat with ritually unclean hands?" Yeshua answered them, Yeshayahu, or prophet Isaiah, was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, and he goes on to quote from Yeshayahu 29:13. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is useless, because they teach man-made rules as if they were doctrine. You depart from God's commands and hold on to human tradition. Indeed, he said to them, you have made a fine art of departing from God's command in order to keep your tradition. And what we don't know in Christian circles, religious circles, what we don't realize is that Jesus is not speaking against the Torah that God gave to Moshe. What he's talking about is an oral law that was handed down generation to generation after the children of Israel came back from Babylonian captivity. Because they didn't want to transgress the Torah, they were well-meaning in their effort, but they built a fence around the Torah. That fence was a safeguard that they began to say, if you obey these external rules, rituals, traditions, you won't transgress the Torah, and that'll keep us from getting banished from the land again. Unfortunately, what had happened was man, loving the praise of other men and loving control over people, began to make these traditions laws, religious laws, religious codes by which they governed the people. Sadly, these religious codes were man-made, and all they did was to make things very complicated in getting to God. It became so convoluted that they were not expressing the heart of the Torah of Moshe that God gave to the Israelites to keep. I'm saying all this because this tradition of the elders was battled by not only Jesus, but the Apostle Paul and the other disciples. These rules tried to creep in after Yeshua was resurrected, and they began to say that people had to be circumcised in order to be fully converted or fully saved and accepted into the family of God. So we interpret this, not knowing this back history, that in passages like Colossians chapter 2 or Romans or Galatians, that this is teaching against the Torah of Moshe, which is a huge contradiction of Scripture and would eliminate Jesus from being the Messiah. Because Deuteronomy 13 said, if a prophet arises and even does miracles, but tells us let's go after other gods, like a God that says the Torah has been abolished, you're not supposed to fear that prophet. It's a huge contradiction because Psalms 119:89 says the law, your word is established forever, O Lord. Well, if his word is established forever, how could he send a Messiah to abolish it? 1 John 3:4, John writes, sin is the violation of Torah. This is after Jesus is resurrected. Sin is the violation of Torah, and no one who says they know God continues to violate the Torah. We ignore scriptures in Acts that show the apostles worshiping on Shabbat, the Sabbath, in the synagogues, persuading people of Yeshua being the Messiah, the Mashiach. We ignore Paul's vow, his Nazirite vow, which can be found in Numbers chapter 6. We ignore Paul saying, I have to go to Jerusalem to observe the feast in Acts chapter 18, verse 21. And instead, we interpret that somehow when Paul is speaking about the law of sin and death, or the bill of ordinances that have been nailed to the cross, that's not talking about Torah, friends. That's talking about man-made tradition. And no, we are not saved by observing man-made traditions, nor are we saved by observing Torah, but we are saved by grace and obedient by faith. Jesus even said to John, the baptizer, when John wanted to say, no, don't, you should be baptizing me, he said, let us do all that righteousness requires. I just wanted to help you understand, because I know some people aren't history buffs and don't like history, and you've got to dig and find the historical accounts of what the discussion and the arguments were about. The circumcision party constantly saying that circumcision was required before allowing people to be accepted as saved. All of these things were going on in the first century. And we've interpreted it to mean that we aren't supposed to learn the Torah, and we're not supposed to learn about the feasts of the Lord, and we're not supposed to keep the original Sabbath, when the Sabbath was being celebrated all through the first century until about 325 AD, when Greek philosophers started coming into the fellowships and saying, well, you can do it this way too. And then finally Constantine in 325 AD, the Roman emperor, said there's going to be a general consensus. And they were anti-Semites. And they rejected everything that was connected to the Jewish people, which to them belonged the prophets and the writings and the feasts and the new moons. But they rejected that. They wanted salvation through Jesus, but they didn't want anything else that Jesus came and lived and practiced for us to see. These are the thoughts rolling around in my head, and I hope this causes you to do your own research. You should test everything and not just take my word for it. I see today us practicing things that have nothing to do with what God gave us according to the Torah to enjoy. And that makes me wonder why we're unwilling to search these truths out and to understand the backstory so that we can better understand Scripture and what was going on, what the debates and arguments were about, what were the doctrinal differences. Yeshua, Jesus, he said, I give you, he said, my doctrine is not my own, but him who sent me. And if you look in Proverbs, Proverbs says, I give you good doctrine, forsake not my law. So this is what I wanted to share with you tonight, and I hope it helps someone maybe in the valley of decision of beginning to celebrate Torah, but somebody's told you if you start celebrating this Sabbath, you've fallen from grace or something. You're relying on it for your salvation, which is a real tragedy, because we know as Gentiles, as people grafted in to the cultivated olive tree of Israel, once you know the truth, that's not what's going on. There is a continuing wrestling match as to whether we're going to do the works of righteousness or whether we're going to absolutely ignore so much of what God says and only do, maybe about 85%. In the Pentecostal church, I learned a song, Lord, I'm running, trying to make 100, 99 and a half won't do. That's very true for our day and age as people abandon the good word and law of God and do whatever they say they want in their own eyes and basically are living lawless. I don't want to be lawless. I want to be faithful. Laila Tov.